There you go. So welcome everyone. Before we fully dive in, we want to respectively acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and also Tsleil-Waututh territories, colonially known as Vancouver. This is where the Threading Change head office is based. We also have folks joining us from Algonquin territory in Ontario. And to us, we re-express our commitment to reconciliation, as we strongly believe that it is our moral responsibility as settlers on these lands to ensure that our meetings and actions are congruent with Indigenous people's values and interests. We know that a land acknowledgement is merely an initial step and is by no means to replace the necessary work that needs to be done to walk towards the path of reconciliation together. And we are the Threading Change team are continuously committed to learning and relearning as we are settlers on this land. So the topic today is diving into the theme of Fashion Revolution Week 2022, which is money, fashion, and power, and thinking what are the dynamics of power and money within the fashion industry. As one of the most profitable industries in the world, whether it's in the form of large fast fashion companies, fashion conglomerates, fashion houses, or even small to medium-sized enterprises, is an industry that has a lot of moving pieces within it. But oftentimes, consumers might not be talking about the money, power, and privilege within this industry. So that's what we're trying to do a deeper dive into today. And a guiding question that will guide us through the entire conversation today is also thinking about how can we repair systems, reclaim power, foster reconciliation, and enact reparations and redistribute wealth in the industry. Whereas we call it the R's: repair, reclaim, reconciliation, reparations, and also redistribution. I will now pass it on to Isabel to talk about what we do at Threading Change.
Yeah, so today's webinar is going to go through who we are at Threading Change, a little bit about our values, and then we'll get into our wonderful panelists that we have here today. And then they will introduce themselves for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get into the deep dive Q&A. And then also some other ways that you can join in on Fashion Revolution Week and also with Threading Change to keep this conversation going. So at Threading Change, we have this motto that we use often, and it's a feminist, fossil fuel-free fashion future. And a lot of the work we do at Threading Change is regarding our values, which is on the next slide, and those are upholding intersectionality, placing people before profits, being a youth-led organization. We also center the underrepresented voices, while meaningful to collaborate with a bunch of different sectors and organizations like you see here today. We are a youth-led, justice-oriented organization who works on inputting these values into everything we do, whether it be a webinar or a new program or even our JSM map. And if you're on the next slide. So here's our wonderful panelists that we have here today. We have so many different areas that we can talk about within this topic, and we wanted to get very different perspectives as well as different organizations to talk about how they approach it within their own organization. Go to the next slide. First, I'm going to introduce you all to Elise Epp. Elise is from Fashion Revolution Canada. Elise Epp learned to sew from her mother. She learned about the power of a good outfit from What Not to Wear, Stacy and Clinton. And when Reina Plaza collapsed in 2013, she learned how the clothes we wear impacts people and the planet. In 2015, Elise made the commitment to only buy ethical clothing or make her own. Since then, she has become a vocal supporter of slow fashion, an enthusiastic researcher and communicator, and the go-to source for friends trying to find ethical clothing. Elise is the graphic designer for a sustainable development think tank and lives with her 2 cats, Mode and Felix. Thank you so much, Elise, for joining us here today. If you want to take this time now to introduce yourself to all of us and our audience, that'd be amazing.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I can confirm that I do have cats. This one is Felix. He's very happy to be here. Is this the moment where I introduce Fashion Revolution? Yes. Okay, great. So I'm the country coordinator for Fashion Revolution Canada, and Fashion Revolution, it started out of, so the Rana Plaza collapse that's in my bio, that's also sort of the initial point for Fashion Revolution. So it was a building that housed several garment factories in Bangladesh, and the day before the collapse, they had noticed cracks in the walls, and people who worked at other businesses in the building were told to go home, but the garment workers were told that they needed to come back the next day or they would lose their jobs. And then at 9 a.m. on April 24th, 2013, the building collapsed, killing over 1,100 people, injuring thousands more. And it was this huge moment. There are industrial disasters regularly, which is awful, but they don't sort of make the global news in the way that Rana Plaza did. And so in the wake of that, Ursula de Castro and Carrie Summers in the UK, they started Fashion Revolution. And so the first sort of big campaign was around who made my clothes. And that was really encouraging consumers in particular to tag brands on Instagram, to ask them, where are my clothes made, who made them, in part because, so when Rana Plaza collapsed, they didn't know, what brands were even being made there. It was just the only way that they found out was because they, was seeing the garment tags in the rubble. And so there was this big question of like, well, how can we improve things if we don't even know where, who's making clothes where? Like there's so much obscured. And so the Who Made My Clothes campaign was really about trying to bring that to light, telling brands that like, this is important to me. I need to know that you know who's making your clothes. And so Fashion Revolution also has our sort of flagship Fashion Transparency Index, which looks at sort of the largest brands, I think 200 brands at this point, and seeing how much of their information is publicly available. Information on sort of environmental issues, where they're getting their materials and how they're treating things, and also I believe that in the Fashion Transparency Index last year, they found that only 1% of brands were could knowledgeably say that they were paying their workers a living wage. And so it delves into all sorts of issues about how our clothes are made. And then sort of a big thing this year, which I might get into a bit more later, but a new campaign is Good Clothes, Fair Pay, which is surrounding legislation that they're trying to make happen in the EU around making brands, like legislating brands need to pay their workers a living wage. If they want to sell in the EU, they need to be able to prove that they are paying their workers appropriately. So that sort of is the history of Fashion Revolution. At this point, we are in, I think, over 90 countries. It's really become a global movement of, starting from grassroots, just groups of volunteers in various places all over the world. So that's something that I also find very cool about this organization.
Yeah, it's really this blend of the local meets global, and we see it so much at the local chapters. It's so beautiful. Well, thank you, Elise, for introducing that to us.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Elise. And just a shameless plug in talking about the Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign. The second event we're doing this Thursday is actually a youth and fashion policy workshop that's talking about how we can be fashion activists and embed fashion justice in our daily lives beyond just being a conscious consumer. And we're using the policy lens of the Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign that's been enacted in the EU to see how you can push for fashion legislation and change in that way. So if you're interested, we'll be posting a link in the chat later on this session, so you can join for Thursday. And next up, I'm so pleased to introduce Musumi Sarangi. When Musumi from Fairwear agreed to speak, we were ecstatic because we love the work that Fairwear does and an impact it has. Musumi joined Fairwear in 2017. She's responsible for the Gender Equality and Inclusion Program in Asia and Program Management in India. She has over 12 years of experience in managing gender and inclusion programs in South Asia. Now I invite Musumi to talk a little bit about her work and also Fairwear Foundation.
Thank you, and very good evening from India. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion today and excited of how the discussions will emerge, because money and power are very crucial topics when we talk about the garment sector, and especially with COVID. Both these issues came very strongly in the forefront of how this redistribution needs to be done. Coming to the organization that I'm associated with, I work with Fairwear Foundation. It is a Dutch independent multi-stakeholder initiative, which means that our governance is representative of business, civil society, and trade union. That makes our work objective. So we have an objective viewpoint into how the textile sector can be made more sustainable. We have about 130 small and medium-sized brands as our members, and we work in our member supply chains to improve the lives of garment workers. So we look towards a contribution where the garment industry supports workers' life to safe, dignified, and properly paid employment, mainly working to operationalize human rights due diligence, showing with our member brands that change is possible. And in this shared goal of the garment industry, where about 75% of workers are women, we endeavor to exercise their right to freedom of association and have access to safe and dignified employment. And we continue to work both collectively and individually to influence the attitudes, knowledge, and behavior of actors in the supply chain, but primarily brands. Brands, because that's where the power and money lies and from where the change can begin. Fairwear has been working since 1999, and we've expanded to more than 13 countries where we have an active presence. Though our brands have presence even wider, but we have like human resource in these countries, mainly in the production countries, so that we can be closer to the voices of worker and drive this change for the garment textile supply chain. I'll stop here and I'll speak more about the organization and work as we move ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Musumi. Really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to hearing more about Fairwear in the question and answer period. And by the way, if you have any questions or panelists that pop up, feel free to put them in the chat box and we will get to them during the audience question and answer period. And now I pass it to Isabel to introduce Billy.
Yeah, so today we also have Billy as our last panelist. And Billy Yates is coming from Clean Clothes Campaign. He is the US Director for the Pay Your Workers campaign, a global effort of over 260 unions and labor organizations to demand immediate pandemic relief for garment workers and industry reform. Previously, he worked as a union organizer with National Nurses United, fighting with nurses across the US for respect on the job and safe staffing. So it's such a pleasure to have Billy here with us today. I would like to pass it off to Billy to introduce his work at Clean Clothes Campaign and some of the projects he's been working on.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. It's so nice to be thinking about the future, together, because we're living in a world that's been created by a lot of people who are very short-term thinkers. And so it's great to be in this space working with people who are looking ahead and trying to figure out what's the best way forward. So I'm a representative right now for this Clean Clothes campaign. And one of the biggest campaigns that we're working on is the Pay Your Workers campaign. Like as Isabel mentioned, 260 unions around the world and also labor rights organizations have endorsed this campaign. which is pushing one to obviously pay your workers. During the pandemic, as was already mentioned, a lot of production slowed down, and this was an excuse for a lot of companies to make a lot of money. We see this in the US and Canada and Europe with our own lives here, but we also see this. This was super dramatic in garment producing countries. So the first demand is for them to pay their workers. The second demand is to set up a severance guarantee fund. One of the biggest problems that happens is brands in particular, will move production along and they'll leave workers without any of their legally mandated severance, no matter what the laws in those countries say. So we say brands have to put up severance first, because we already know that this is a problem that is endemic in the garment worker industry. And lastly, we want brands to sign an agreement saying that they'll respect the rights of workers to unionize. I think when looking at our topics today, workers know what's best for workers, and we have to respect that. And that has to be made clear to the brands that they are they are directly linked to the workers that are employed for them, something that brands across the world have tried to evade for a long time. It's not my fault. I'm Nike or Adidas. It's the supplier somewhere in another country that's their fault. So we want to make this connection very clear that brands have to respect workers' rights, and that includes the right for workers to democratically determine what they want and form a union. Previously, really quickly, I started as a student with United Students Against Sweatshops, organizing across campuses in the United States. And that was kind of my introduction to the garment industry and the global labor rights in general. And so happy to be back. It's a crucial time for labor rights around the world. And it's something where we can really make the connections locally, what's happening down the street with what's happening across the world right now. And it's going to take all of us working together to improve it. So happy to be here. Thank you all for having me. And I think that's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Billy. And we're really looking forward to the perspective you bring to the table regarding to the topic of money, fashion, and privilege and power, especially from experience of working on the ground and coming from a different sector as well. And with that, we are very pleased to jump into the question and answer period. These are questions that the Redistributing Change team come up with and we're interested in. Just a reminder, if you have some, we put it in the chat. So the first question I have, and I think we'll just go in order of the panelists, so it'll be Elise, and then Musumi, and then Billy, just for easy purposes. Sorry, Elise, to have you go first again. So the first question is, which areas in the fashion industry do you see the most money and power? And could you elaborate on why?
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, immediately, I think of the brands who hold so much money and power. Like I've seen this kind of move around a few times, but that some of the sort of top brand CEOs make in a couple of days what a garment worker or more than a garment worker can make in the course of their whole life. And I think that like the inequality between those really shows that power imbalance. One of the issues is that, because brands hold all of the power, they can sort of set the rules. And I mean, I feel like Musumi, in particular, you will probably have even more insight on this, but like brands are able to, sorry, I have had just a brain a moment here. Let me jump in with, so during COVID, as Billy said, like brands canceled orders and then they didn't pay for orders that had already maybe even been completed. And so that left people who were already not being paid anywhere near a living wage, not even getting paid for the work that they had done. And the big brands just kind of get away with it, because if they pull out entirely, then they're also left with no jobs. And so, yeah, so the big brands really get to call the shots, and everyone has to fall in line.
Great answer, Elise. I think that really highlights just how during COVID, the injustice was just heightened even more. Not only did a lot of government workers have to support their families still, but also dangerous conditions working in factories that are enclosed, where there's coal particulates in the air, and they might be spreading it to people in their households. Maybe some of them didn't really return home from work. So I think COVID also heightened a really dangerous time for government workers that also had a lot of inequities present. Musumi, would you like to go next?
Yeah, can't agree more to what Elise said. The brands hold the power and the money in the whole supply chain. Though brands and retailers are not direct employers of workers in the supplier factories making their product, but their sourcing model and purchasing practices have full influence of what the wages in the factory will be, what the working hours in the factory will be. So the global north has a lot of power of what a life of a worker in, say, India, Bangladesh, Cambodia would be like. And they can change that, they can improve that. But are they willing to share a tiny cent of their profits? Unfortunately not. So their purchasing and sourcing decisions lead to labor violations across the supply chain, and things that can be improved but do not. Because again, and I'd like to pull in Billy here, that we have very little unionization in the garment sector, especially in the global south. India that I come from, unionization is about 5% across sectors and less than 1% in the garment sector. That makes for very limited voices of workers being heard, voices of workers that have representations. So, when I talk about sourcing decisions, there's the contracts between brands and suppliers is very vague, which in turn makes the supplier in a position where the wages are low. And I'm not here defending suppliers, but that there is not enough incentive for suppliers to make those changes. All the human rights due diligence that we talk of, who pays for it? We need the brands to pay for it. It's not just the supplier that needs to pay for it. And a supplier, when we think of a supplier, majority of them also come from very small, medium-sized constructs. They are not these huge brands that we are talking about. And brands use this to their advantage. They can shift countries, geographies, suppliers within the same geography, spread thin, so that the accountability is very little when it comes to making change in lives of workers and suppliers in the production countries. So for anything that we do to change this power imbalance of brands and retailers, we need more representations of workers and more voices of workers strongly heard on tables where decisions are made, because they need to be the center of decisions. Otherwise, this imbalance, we have been talking for a huge number of decades, we'll continue to talk about it without making the right amount of change. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Musumi. I think that highlights really well how within the supply chain and the value chain, there's so many different actors. Many times you might just think it's the garment workers or it's the brands, but in between there's the suppliers, there's the distribution center, there's the warehouse. And a lot of garment workers are also reporting to one central leader in that factory that might be calling on the shots. So even if it's empowering a certain group of people, we also have to think about the privileges and the different pyramids that exist within that power structure as well. So thank you for bringing that to light. Billy, on to you.
Yeah, workers all over the world are fighting back, union or no union, when their factories are being closed, when violations are happening. And, as the home to a lot of these brands, it's up to us to kind of work in solidarity with the workers where they are already organizing, So bringing together people who are organizing together, I think one really clear example, in 2020, Industrias Florenzi is a factory that was in El Salvador that closed down after, almost, workers had been there 10, 15 years. And of course, this was, the company said it was due to the pandemic, but research happened and, workers went on hunger strike. They went to the factory and they wouldn't leave the machines there because they could sell that later. So they were demanding their severance. what the Clean Clothes campaign can do is did some research. They were actually making clothes for a company called Barco. And a lot of time garment workers, identifying the big brand, they can see it, but we have some research where we can make the connection. So Barco was using Grey's Anatomy. So all we had to do really, the workers on the ground were already organizing, already pushing this, and it came from us to put some pressure on Grey's Anatomy to get them, because that's what the scrubs were coming from. And also we involved the National Nurses United, former employer, to get involved as well, because that's a nurses union. Why shouldn't that be an issue? We have to connect all these issues. At the end of the day, 200 workers were paid almost in total $1 million, which is a huge, huge sum, averaging for garment workers in El Salvador. And I think the message to come from that is that when we do find the ways to work in solidarity together, when we can use our leverage here and they're using their leverage there in the factory and on the ground, we can make things happen, because the brands are located here. The consumers a lot of times are here. We do have to, I think it goes to the point that we have to support the union movement and the Foundation of Independent Unions, and then we have to build together, because I think that's the only way. We're taking on multinational corporations. It's only going to be with international efforts that we can do the right thing and kind of take this power back. And I just on the idea of power, which we're going to keep talking about, but one thing that's really insidious to me is the way that brands are not just brands. So the Pay Your Workers campaign, we're targeting Adidas, which for various reasons, but owes $11 million in Cambodia and a lot of other things. But so I just stalk Adidas social media all the time. And Adidas running, which you wouldn't think, is just a running brand, but it's become a lifestyle. They have Adidas running groups and it's about health and mental wellness and all of these things. And on the Adidas running page, they're talking about, this is our anti-racist reading list, and this is why refugees happen. And, do you want a brand to be the one to be co-opting these social movements, which are really important in the United States and abroad? And, we're trying to transform our society, and brands find a way to get in there. They find a niche, they find a way to really twist a lot of people's minds. And instead of organizing and building power, you're reading what Adidas told us to read. And Adidas is no model to be telling us about, all of these things. So I do want to point out, I just wanted to obviously vent a little bit, but also, I think we can think about power that way as well. Not just purely economic things, but their ability, their really insidious marketing ability, the way that they, endorse celebrities that influence us. And I think we have to be clear that, if you're doing business with this company, you have to be accountable to the workers as well. It doesn't matter how cool you are, how hip, how whatever fit, the bottom line should be, how can we support workers who are organizing? So that's thoughts on power.
Amazing. Thank you, Billy. I just dropped a link in the chat, and I think what you said about brands, now becoming activists to sell into market is definitely a very huge phenomenon in the fashion industry. Isabel made an amazing post that explains what purple washing and femme washing is. That's essentially talking about, brands co-opting the International Women's Day with the feminist movement in order to sell more clothing, but their boards of directors or the leadership don't reflect a female leading or a feminist board. At a conference I was at, we also came up with the term blue washing, people that are using oceanography or even maybe seafood as a way to co-opt the ocean sustainability movement. So greenwashing, purple washing, blue washing, it's all coming together. That's wonderful. Thank you all for your viewpoints. I will pass on to Isabel to ask the next question.
Yeah, that was a great first question, first bit of discussion. I think also I resonate with what Billy was saying about how this industry is a cultural thing and they use that to their advantage right now. And we're seeing that a lot. And how we all have said that this is a very important time for the labor movement. And we're starting to see these shifts, which is so important. So yeah, on to our next question. What does degrowth in the fashion industry mean to you? Now, when we talk about degrowth too, we're talking about the global capitalist system and the fashion industry, how it's pursuing growth at all costs, whether that be causing human exploitation or environmental destruction. So yeah, Elise, I don't know if you want to start this one off again.
Yeah, I can. So when I think about degrowth, I think about the big brands making, all sorts of announcements about sustainability initiatives. And then, the next week there's an announcement about how they intend to, double production in the next 10 years. And those are just so completely incompatible. Like the rate of production is, among all of the problems in the fashion industry, like the rate of production is one of the big ones, because you have, so I know like in the States between 2000 and 2018, the amount of textiles going into the landfill doubled. And then you have, like Continental Market in Accra, Ghana, where it's this huge secondhand market where I think it was 15 million or 30 million new items arrive every week. Those are mostly clothes coming from the global north. And then like 40% of that ends up, they can't sell it because it's so, it's not good enough quality, or like it's a winter coat that's now in Ghana and they don't have a use for that, or like for various reasons, 40% of the clothes from the global north that end up in the secondhand market end up, going into their environment, often in like informal landfills, which sounds pretty much like a euphemism. And so there's this massive amount of clothing. If you make a few of them out of organic cotton, but it still ends up, spilling into the ocean, then I don't think that you can really claim that you're being sustainable. There's one somewhat disheartening. There's a survey done in Britain recently that found, it was asking consumers what they thought were like the top sustainable brands. And among the top ones, Nike, Nike, H&M, and Amazon were in their top 5, I think, which is just incredible that those are the brands that consumers think are really making sustainable headway. But at the same time, like nothing is sustainable at this scale. You can take the very best fabric, but if you produce it that quantity, like there isn't a way to do it sustainably. Like, so I was looking into lyocell, and you may have heard about Tencel. Lyocell, Tencel's like the name brand, but with that comes sort of certain, they have their own particular like production process. So, but the generic lyocell, so it's made from eucalyptus, which is often called like super sustainable because it can grow really easily in places that, maybe don't grow other crops well, doesn't need a whole lot of water, doesn't need pesticides, it grows really quickly. But like, it's one thing if you're like cutting down 3 eucalyptus trees to make a small batch of fabric. But it's another thing when it's like, when everyone realizes that eucalyptus is like the big sustainable source. And so then they start, cutting down natural forests to plant, monocrops of eucalyptus. I found there was an article from the LA Times in 1990 where they're saying that in Portugal, eucalyptus forests are called fascist forests because of like big corporations come in and take over local farmland and displace communities, grow these huge eucalyptus forests. And I think in that case, it was mostly being used for paper, but then they get to say that they are, using sustainable materials. But in fact, they've actually, affected the local ecosystem, local culture, all in this effort to like look green, but actually cause a whole lot of environmental and social issues. I'm seeing a note that we have to move on. I am done. That's it.
No, that was amazing, Elise. I think you touched on a lot of things I've been thinking about too, with these biomaterials, or focusing in on one area or one aspect of the industry, but not getting to the root of these issues, or looking at this full picture. And I think that's a big deal right now. And we're coming to these like crossroads right now within the industry of how all these different supply chains and all these different enactors within the industry can come together, basically, because we're not going to solve it by just continuing at the rate we're going with this rate of growth, because we haven't addressed that issue yet, I don't think yet, with a material. So it's so true. And yeah, and it has to do with looking at all the very many different aspects. Mansumi, would you like to touch upon what does degrowth mean to you within the
Part
industry?
of it is already covered by Elise. She looked at the material, production, overproduction, consumption side. I'd like to draw attention to what does it mean to people who produce our clothes. Is it something that impacts them? Will it impact them positively? Will it have a negative impact? Because when we talk of production, theoretically, the concept is the more you want, the workers will produce more, there will be, jobs for them, suppliers will be in business. Can we turn it around and look, if we produce slow, less, to go away from the fast fashion mold, and still we are able to make profits and pay workers fairly, even though the production is less? Can we look at a model like that? It is doable, but can we change that perception? Because there's also a lot of fear with all this conversation on degrowth happening in the global south. What does it mean for my business? And that's where we need more awareness, more engagement of how this is of use to the planet, also to the people who make our clothes. Because we've been talking about landfills, oceans, material, water, all very, very relevant, but it also means positive gain, increment for workers who make them, without taking away from their daily livelihood. So this is the conversation of a balanced degrowth that we need to embark on and stress urgently on. Because the numbers that Elise meant, I looked at some data before this, before coming into this webinar, and the same article that Elise was referring to, they still made profits in spite of about this $4.3 million clothing being dumped. The industry, the brand still made profit. So if you can still make profit without that production, you need to rethink of what your purchasing decisions are. And as basic, I'm not even going into organic, I'm not going into sustainable. Basic, even if you had not produced it, you still made those profits. Even if you didn't sell it, you still made those profits. And because of your overproduction, what have you done to the bottom tail end of your supply chain? You have put them in precarious work conditions. You have put them into hours of work without remuneration that substantiates for work. We keep hearing about brands saying, we pay minimum wages in countries where we produce. Do you know what a minimum wage is also? It's less than 1/4 of a living wage that we talk of. it's poverty wages we are talking about, and we are proud of it. So when we talk of degrowth, I think again I'll reiterate, and also as Fairware, we want to put workers in middle of this conversation as drivers of this conversation, not as recipients of what decisions are made in boardrooms. Of course, the power is there, but how can we shift this engagement? How can we bring workers into this conversation as active participants, not just recipients of poverty wages that the supply chain offers them? So yeah, I'll leave it at that thought on degrowth.
Yeah, that was very well said. That was, I think, the most important thing that anyone can take away from this is that workers need to be a part of that degrowth and have to be at the table addressing how to degrowth, how that can be put into place. Because they are at the tail end of the supply chain. They're often left out of every conversation. And that is a way to shift the power, like you said. Billy, I would like to pass it off to you.
Yeah, thanks for connecting it all, actually, Isabel, because I was going to say, workers are very well aware of, sustainability issues, and whether it's pollution in the factory or what's going on in their community. And in some of these places where garments are being produced are also the most going to be adversely affected by climate change, and already are. So I think right now we're so many steps into the climate emergency. It's, I don't even know what we can call it anymore. People are Extinction Rebellion, people are really out there, and we have no choice but to do direct action in a lot of ways. And I'll speak candidly, I know it's being recorded, but from, I think it's super urgent. And I think that workers have a lot of power and we can use this to connect all of these issues. Okay, so we have workers being underpaid. We have a climate that's, causing people to be unable to live in these places. And then we have refugees. And we have this cycle of all of these things happening. And who's not being affected? The CEO of Adidas is not. The CEO of Nike is not. All of these people, and there's a very clear racial element you could actually draw from this, that they're repeating over and over and over again, while at the same time, their brand ambassadors are like the hippest, coolest, black and brown bodies that they want to use to sell things and to continue this cycle. So I think that's why when we talk about brand responsibility, we have to bring it back to the brands, and that these people are living comfortably. These people are going to be fine. Their grandkids going to be fine. Everything's going to be good. They're figuring out how to get off planet Earth so they can go to the moon. We have to bring it back that these people have to be very uncomfortable in order for there to be any real meaningful change. And I degrowth on a personal basis, I think is something really important for people to think about and to act on. I think just building this bigger scheme of things, because sometimes it's so hard to understand how much money these brands really have. And we don't even know, it's hard to wrap our minds around these numbers, right? And I think that we have to keep our mind on that's the target. Let's talk about redistributing that, and then we can move on forward. But until that happens, until they feel anything, until they feel any pain inflicted on them, I don't think they're going to change. And it's not going to matter how much degrowth I do if they're able, jet setting around the world, making money. So that's, thoughts on degrowth. But yeah, I think the other panelists connected all. We had a very good progression in connecting all of the things. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me last.
No, that was amazing. I mean, it's true. They're getting away with a lot, and we have to make sure that the pressure we put on them trickles up. Mansumi, you have your hand up. Did you want to add a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention of everybody in this conversations on suppliers. We keep looking at them as suppliers / brands, but it is a different entity. It cannot be clubbed into one. And in our work with Fairware, something that we are trying to do is how do we also strengthen the voices of suppliers to have more efficient sourcing dialogue with the brands, and then also capacitate them to have a social dialogue with unions. Because this is one element, one category that is sorry, Billy, you might not like it, is also squeezed a lot. You know, we have a lot of expectations from them that you pay up, you do the human rights due diligence for brands up there, you pay the living wage also. But are we supporting them enough to be part of this conversation? Are we listening enough to them, engaging with them, and do they have the capacity? They might have the knowledge or the awareness because they have been in business, but do they have the capacity to do that? That's a big question. And in any conversation of money, power, degrowth, how do we engage the suppliers is a critical element for any work that we want to do in the supply chain.
I was just going to say, I totally agree. You know, we can think of suppliers. I try to make an analogy to the workplace. They're kind of like the middle managers, right? They're getting squeezed by the brand pressure, and they're also getting squeezed by the workers. And there's a lot of the brand, suppliers are coming from East Asian countries. And they're operating in Cambodia, Indonesia, all these places, and they're getting really squeezed in a way that, I think Mansumi brought up, addresses the pressure that the brand is also putting on suppliers. And, it's a very precarious because if they're not meeting a certain amount, right, then they're free, then the brand is free to move production other places or choose other things. So I think it's an important part of the conversation and something to keep in mind, like you said, as we're addressing all of these dynamics within the garment worker industry.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, to your responses. In the interest of time, we're going to skip this question, also because we feel that all of our answers in the last question already touched on this one, which is great. We had a feeling that would happen anyways, but it was talking about, is it possible to redistribute money and power in the fashion industry? So you can kind of sit on that and then fit this into the next final question we have for all of you. So the last question is, we're seeing a greater recognition of the deeply rooted systemic injustices in fashion come more to surface in recent years. Google searches of sustainable fashion and ethical fashion has boomed in the last 2 years alone. What opportunities do you see within your avenue of work to create change in this area?
I guess I go first again. This is sort of an overwhelming question because on the one hand, it feels like the deeply rooted systemic injustices are that's such a big issue to tackle that doing a campaign, even if it's successful, that can only do so much. But I can speak to sort of some of the ways that we are trying to chip away at that, at least. I think largely, those are, we're in a whole bunch of partnerships that are, actually making some change. One thing that's really that brings me a lot of hope is the Bangladesh Accord, which was signed shortly after Rana Plaza collapsed in an effort to make working conditions more safe, and sort of a major issue. So essentially, European brands signed the Bangladesh Accord and North American brands signed a different thing, and the Bangladesh Accord is actually legally binding, so that if once you sign on, there are actually repercussions if you don't go through with it. The North American one was just sign a thing that says that you promise to do better, but no one will check up on you. So the Bangladesh Accord was actually really important because, so it was holding the brands responsible legally, and also, so by 2021, they had done 38,000 factory inspections, looking into things like, structural integrity and, fire exits, some of these things that have been the source of, the disasters that make it into the news. And so they've done 38,000 factory inspections. And by January 2021, 93% of the issues had been resolved. And that it's in sort of an area that feels like it's really hard to enact any change. That feels like something tangible. There are factories, 93% of the factories that had issues, or fixed them. And now, this factory has safe fire exits. They're no longer, locked gates. And so that feels really tangible. There's also, in California, there was the Garment Worker Protection Act, which passed, I think, in the fall. And that was sort of this big, like the little guy actually won. Billy might have more on this because it is very much tied to garment worker union in the States, but so garment workers were being paid for piecework, which is where you paid by sort of each seam you sew rather than being paid by the hour. And so there in Los Angeles in particular, there are presumably still like really sweatshop conditions. And so the Garment Worker Protection Act, it mandates that garment workers are paid minimum wage. So they can't, so with piecework, they're being paid like maybe half minimum wage when it all sort of worked out. So they have to be paid at least minimum wage. And a big thing also is that brands are held partially responsible. They can't say that, oh, well, we thought they were being paid minimum wage. We didn't know. They can't say it's like, oh, there are layers of contracts in between us and the garment workers. So we didn't know. Like if you are getting your clothes produced in garment factories in Los Angeles, the brands are being held responsible for that. And so, those certainly aren't Fashion Revolution specific initiatives, but we are, partnering and supporting and sort of trying to be part of the team pushing to have these things happen. And I see a lot of hope in changing legislation and that it can actually happen in these instances.
Thank you so much, Elise. And Musumi and Billy, your thoughts to wrap us up?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question, and how do I sum it up is a challenge here. See, we're talking about change at multiple levels, given the complexity of the garment sector itself. It's so fragmented, and it keeps changing. It's not that, you're producing in one country today or in a region today, you will not move out. So it's so vulnerable, complex, and fragmented that even the governments in these countries, the production countries, are coerced to keep the labor laws weak. We were part of these discussions just before COVID in India, when Ethiopia was opening up, and for the garment sector in a big way with their laws, that should we as country, and by we I don't mean fair wear, the government here was trying to look at how do we tweak the legislation so that production from India doesn't go to Ethiopia, which means how can we keep raising the bar lower so that the production stays, and who pays for it? The worker. So we are again talking about change at multiple levels, and that is possible when we bring brands to this conversation accountable. And when I mean brands, not the CSR colleagues. We have to get the sales and marketing people as part of conversations. Like in my many conversations with suppliers, they tell me, the CSR guys come, they tell us, why don't you do trainings with workers on gender-based violence? Why don't you do trainings with workers on what labor rights are? And we do all of that, and the marketing guy comes and doesn't even reduce, doesn't even increase 50 cents, because it will make a dent in their already big profits. So we are talking to two very different entities, again with brands, when we talk of addressing these systematic imbalances. And that, again, we need to unpack these big things. So we keep putting these key stakeholders in one basket. Like even brands, we put them in one basket. We again have to unpack, who do we need to engage with? Because they keep coming back to us and telling that, okay, we are doing all this, but tell us, when will our costs be enough to pay for those trainings? When will these costs be enough to pay for these due diligence that we do? So if you do not give us a fair price, you will have people making changes which are unfair. Again, not supporting suppliers, but it's going to be a trickle down effect. So your overhead production costs don't change. What changes is your labor costs. That's where you again push workers down the supply chain. So, you see all the first year suppliers, compliant, small, doing well, having all their trainings in place. They have their due diligence in place. But you see slowly workers going to informality in areas of work which are home-based, where there is hardly any legislation, hardly any accountability to ensure that their working conditions are improved, and these injustices can be looked at. So, one is, how do you engage all actors in the supply chain to bring about change? And how do you, again, within these actors, break them up? Because unless we look at them as, different entities with different agendas. So a CSR guy has a different agenda. The marketing sales guy has a different agenda, and how do you again translate your internal policies, which are very well documented, to down your supply chain, and speak about that equality down your supply chain. Just to share a little bit about the current work there as Fairware that we are doing, we have a program with 6 organizations: Fairware, an MSI based in Netherlands, ETI and MSI based in UK, 2 labor rights organizations, CIVIDEP in Bangalore, CDI in Vietnam, and 2 Dutch trade unions. We're trying to look at shifting this power imbalance with engagement of all stakeholders, putting workers at the center of the conversation. Again, as Stitch alone we can't do. We need to look at who our allies are and bring in the solidarity into this space. Because if you want to change it, our small initiatives are great as examples, but they will not shift the power. How do we then connect these dots? Like the conversation we are having today, how do we convert this conversation into some collective action of where we support each other in making that change, rather than just saying, oh, well done, we've had a good conversation on power imbalance, but not do anything about it. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Amazing. Billy, wrap us up.
Awesome. I love going after Masumi because it bleeds in really well. So I think one of the things to think about, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which happened in New York over 100 years ago, was a big watershed moment for the labor movement in the United States. And what happened was, after that, garment workers started organizing, kind of similar to Rana Plaza, in that it took a big catastrophe to get people organized. And so they organized, and they had great benefits. They had like a bowling alley, they had like time off, they enjoyed, social activities, they had retreat houses. All of that was getting paid for. And what did the companies do? They moved to the South. And after they moved to the South, after NAFTA, after, the free trade agreements that our governments pushed in with the backing of corporations, where did the companies move? They moved to Mexico. After Mexico, where did they move? When costs got higher there, they went to Central America. Right? Exactly what Masum was saying, like between India and Ethiopia, when does this end actually? How many times are they going to pit workers against each other all around the world? And so you're constantly fighting this race to the bottom. And I think that's where we need international cooperation among worker unions. And I think that they have to be talking to each other, because at the end of the day, you may be in Ethiopia, you may be in India, you may be in El Salvador. I'm buying the shirt in the United States. We're all kind of connected to this one company. And it's hard to see that when you're in your factory. It's hard to see that, the bigger picture of just how widespread this is. And corporations and governments, all they want to do is divide us and keep us buying things, right? They don't want us to see that I'm connected to this person who's in another country. And brands have used this threat before. To stop unionization, I think one of the best examples is in Central America, where there's a lot of smaller countries where the US has intervened militarily, politically, economically for years. And their brands are able to say, because they've unionized in Honduras, we're moving to El Salvador. If you don't accept this wage, if you can't make this much production and this much, then that's okay, we go to Guatemala. So really, I think getting to the point, we're at the point where we need international cooperation for climate change. We need international cooperation for so much right now. I think one of the best things to do is on this campaign that I'm working on right now is bringing brands to the table to sit with workers. Adidas has gotten letters from garment worker unions in 3 different countries with the demand, and they're saying, oh, we're already good. We don't need all of that. So it's going to be an escalation campaign against Adidas, and it's going to be for us to think about what's our leverage here with celebrities, with all of this stuff. Where do we have power in this situation, not just as consumers? While the workers are organizing, the workers have been organizing. They're going to organize with whether we do anything or not, because that's their life. It's up to us to kind of build these connections internationally and think about that. And I have a petition to drop in the thing, but that's just to say, because I do think it will be important. We have to be really imaginative about what do brands care about? What's going to make this brand sign this agreement to respect union rights? That's a big ask. What's going to make them? And they're not going to do it just because they love workers, right? They're going to do it because it takes some pressure. And I think that's where we come in to support the efforts that are already happening on the ground. So I'm gonna drop that in the chat maybe later. But yeah, I think we trace it back to what happened in the industrialization, and that's continuing to happen. But now capital is so flexible, and garment factories can be moved so quickly, production can be moved so quickly, but who can't move? Workers. So that's every free trade agreement that has happened.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Billy. And thank you so much to Elise, Musumi, and Billy for all your great insights today. I recognize that we're a little bit over, so thank you so much to pretty much 99% of people stayed on. So thank you for your great insights, because it was very, very interesting. For the panelists, if you have any links you want to drop in the chat, feel free. We'll be compiling a list of all the resources and also contact lists after this. If people want to follow up with anybody, feel free to also drop your LinkedIns and emails if you would like, if people have any questions. And on the topic of what Musumi said about it's really important to continue the conversation. We here at Threading Change couldn't agree more. We've been to a lot of different panels and sessions where you get people riled up, and it's kind of like, now what? So that's exactly why we're doing a policy jam workshop this Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. That's called Youth in Fashion Policy Workshop, where we're taking examples of policies in fashion that have been enacted successfully. So there's a new Standard Institute, a New York fashion law, SB 62, the garment workers' rights, and also good clothes fair pay is the one we'll be examining, and also the new EU textiles strategy policy that's looking at the context within the EU. So that's part of our youth engagement consulting work. If you're interested, Sarah will be dropping a link in the chat right now on how you can sign up. And we would love all of you to join us and share your expertise as well. And just to quickly wrap up, we are also currently hiring for some positions, paid and unpaid. If you're interested in joining Threading Change, feel free to go to this link, bit.ly/TC Jobs and you get to join this amazing team full of wonderful folks from all across the world. We have people from India, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Brazil, Netherlands. So we would love to have you join our team. And with that, let's keep the conversation growing. You can find us at Threading Change on multiple platforms. We'll have all the links of the panelists, social media channels, and their respective organizations in a context list as well. We'll also have a follow-up survey, so you can give us feedback on how you think this session went. And with that, thank you so much for participating in our panel of redistributing money, fashion, and money and power in the fashion industry. We look forward to seeing you at some more of our events. We'll also have other IGTV lives and events throughout the week. And thank you so much for joining us. You can sign up for a newsletter to keep up to date with all our future events. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.